Okay, everybody, we'll start. Thank you for joining. Again, my name is Larry Cretion, and I am the Director of Green Energy Consumers Alliance. We work in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. We're celebrating our 40th anniversary as an organization this year, 2022. Today's webinar is phasing out gasoline in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Next slide, please. Because we've got a lot of attendees, everyone's muted to avoid background noise, but we will have breaks for questions, particularly at the very end. And we'd ask you to put them into your Q&A box on your GoToMeeting console, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can. We have a lot of slides. We'll go through them so that we can allow time for a lot of questions. We will send you out a recording and the slides themselves for later, so you can have them. Next slide. Today's speakers are myself, Larry Cretion, and Mal Skoran who is our Transportation Program and Policy Coordinator. Our mission as an organization is to harness the power of energy consumers to speed the transition to a low carbon future. We do that in a variety of ways. We have renewable energy programs we've had for a long time. We have a program for EVs called Drive Green. We've had that since November 2016. And right now we have a program, it's a third helping of a program involving heat pumps. If you're not aware of that program, check out our website. And we do a number of other things that you can see on our website. But today's focus is on how we can dramatically reduce our dependence on gasoline. We want to phase out gasoline because the planet needs that to happen, and because there are economic benefits to our region because we import all that petroleum, and there are health benefits. And there are some policy approaches that we want to talk about today in both states. So the outline for today is we'll introduce you to what the goals are of our states in terms of climate, which is the driver for, no pun intended, is the driver for reducing gasoline consumption. What do we mean by phasing it out? And we want to focus on the year 2030, less than 8 years away. And we will talk about legislation we have ongoing in Rhode Island and some principles of legislation in Massachusetts that we're advancing, and we'll allow plenty of time for Q&A. So I think I'll turn this over to Mal, who will cover a lot of ground, and then it'll come back to me. There you go, Mal.
Thanks, Larry. And before I get started, I will again say I'm going to go through the slides quickly, but you'll have access to all of them and more after the presentation is over. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about why Green Energy Consumers is so focused on the transportation sector. And that's because transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island, where we do our work. And so not only does it make up the lion's share of our emissions that cause climate change, if you look at transportation as a whole, the majority of emissions come from light duty vehicles. So those are specifically passenger cars. And so while we think it's important to also electrify buses and trucks and all vehicles of all sizes, it's pretty clear that focusing on cars is not only the low-hanging fruit, but it's also going to help us achieve emissions reductions the fastest, which is what we really care about. There are lots of ways to reduce emissions in the transportation sector. We're big advocates for transit and active mobility, but we know we can't reach Massachusetts and Rhode Island's climate goals, which we'll talk a little bit more about in the next couple of slides, without electric vehicles. That's because electric vehicles under the current electricity system reduce emissions substantially compared to gas-powered cars. So you can see here on this image pulled from the Union of Concerned Scientists website, emissions for an electric vehicle charged in the New England grid are about 75% lower than the average gas-powered car in the US. And so while that's the snapshot right now, electric cars are also going to be getting cleaner every year because our electricity mix is getting cleaner every year. So if we kind of continue on the business as usual track for both Massachusetts and Rhode Island, you can see that every electric car that we put on the road today is actually going to get cleaner over time, which is not something you can say for a gas-powered car, right? Gas-powered vehicles don't get improved mileage or efficiency over time, but electric cars do because of how fast the electricity system is cleaning up. And if either state passes a more ambitious renewable electricity target, like Rhode Island is poised to do this year, to make it a goal or a mandate to increase renewable electricity to 100% by 2030, then every electric car in Rhode Island is going to be powered by absolute zero emissions electricity, making every mile driven zero emissions. So there's a substantial motivation to go or to electrify cars as quickly as possible. And in addition to the climate benefits, there are other benefits as well. The American Lung Association recently released a report that estimated the combined health benefits of switching to electric vehicles and transitioning to a renewable electricity system is about $22 billion through 2050 in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So that's just the health benefits on the table for those two states alone. And those health benefits mostly come from improved air quality, which leads to reduced asthma attacks, less incidence of emphysema, less incidence of heart disease, and other things that impact the health of folks in New England. So we think there's a substantial benefit to public health as well. And I don't have to talk more about how nuts fuel prices have been over the last several months, but one of the benefits of shifting to electricity is that fuel costs are more stable and they're also lower. Even in a place like New England, which has a little bit higher electricity rates, EV drivers are still seeing savings in the aggregate, especially when compared to how volatile gasoline prices are. And then finally, because Massachusetts and Rhode Island aren't oil producing or refining states, a lot of the money that we spend on gasoline and fossil fuels in general just flow right out of our economy because we're not reaping the benefits of that. And so as we shift to a system that relies more heavily on electricity consumption, and particularly clean electricity consumption, we're going to see more local economic benefits through the creation of more jobs, and also by making sure that the dollars that we spend on energy stay here in state to provide more benefits. And so all of that is to say there's lots of benefits in shifting to electric cars. And there currently, there's a goal in the Massachusetts Climate Plan to reach 1 million electric cars by 2030 in order to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030. And so since then, that was the plan as released about a year ago. But since then, the Massachusetts legislature released a more ambitious goal to reduce emissions by 50% in 2030. And so we think we're going to need even more EVs in order to meet that ambitious mandate. And also in the last year, the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which would have created a funding source to support clean transportation investments, has come off the table. And so we at Green Energy Consumers think that in order to meet that 2030 climate mandate in Massachusetts, we need a plan B in order to get 1 million EVs on the road by 2030, because we are not on track to meet that goal under current policy. So you can see on the graph there, there's historic EV sales represented by the bars in blue. And if we continue on the current trajectory, we'll have about 500,000 EVs in Massachusetts by 2030. So that's good, but it's not good enough in order to align with our climate goals. The line in green there is the ramp up that we need in order to get to 1 million EVs by 2030. And the state's own modeling shows that existing policy is not enough to get us there. So we're looking at what needs to be done in order to shift up the market fast enough so that we can meet our climate goals. And there is a similar story in Rhode Island. So again, transportation is the largest source of climate warming emissions in the state. And just last year, Rhode Island passed mandatory climate targets to reduce emissions by 45% in 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. Because the law was just passed last year, we're still waiting on the state's plan in order to figure out how we're going to meet that mandate. However, it's really clear that electric vehicles need to be part of the solution because they're a part of the solution in every state's climate plan that we've seen in the US, and also as part of other countries' efforts to meet their climate goals. So we know EVs are going to be a big part of this plan, but we don't know exactly how yet, and it's urgent to figure it out because a recent report indicated that emissions actually went up from 2017 to 2018. So we're headed in the wrong direction, and transportation is a big part of that problem. And so we don't know exactly how many EVs we're going to need in Rhode Island to meet the 2030 goal, but we do know if we roughly stick to what Massachusetts modeled for meeting their 2030 goal, we're not nearly close enough to be able to reduce emissions from the transportation sector in a way that will let us comply with the Act on Climate. So Rhode Island, compared to every other New England state, is far behind on EV adoption, and so the ramp up is even steeper in order to meet that goal. So we're anxious to see the results of the 2030 plan, but it's not looking like we're going to be able to meet the 2030 target without a significant commitment and change in policy. And so that's where this idea to phase out gasoline starting in 2030 is really coming from, because neither state is on track to meeting its EV adoption goals. And so there needs to be an ambitious, substantial investment in order to get us there. Part of the problem when it comes to decarbonizing cars and replacing dirty cars with cleaner ones is the fact that cars last a very long time. The average age of a car in New England is about 11 years. And so every polluting vehicle that we are putting on the roads from now until 2030 makes it harder and harder to think of a future without gasoline. And so even as EV sales are increasing, we're still putting more gas-powered cars in the roads, and it's committing us to decades of additional gasoline consumption. So the idea of a phase out is that it would only affect new cars registered in the state. So the idea is that starting in 2030, both states, Massachusetts and Rhode Island, would set goals to make sure that no more dirty cars are being placed on the road. The campaign that Green Energy Consumers is working on would still allow plug-in hybrid vehicles, which have an electric rechargeable battery and then a gas backup. However, we think that 2030 is a very reasonable date to start phasing out the sale of gas-powered cars and making sure that we have clean cars on the roads starting in that date. And it's important to note that this is a policy that would only affect new cars. So we wouldn't be taking existing legacy vehicles off the road. We would just be making sure that there's an increasing supply of clean cars starting in 2030. And so we think this is a really reasonable approach because even when we reach 100% EV sales, gasoline cars aren't going to be disappearing overnight. And that's because cars last a very long time on the roads. So you can see as we ramp up to 100% sales, it's going to be a gradual, plannable transition to cleaner cars. So it might sound crazy to start phasing out gasoline-powered vehicles starting in 2030, but what that translates to is a really long period of time where we can prepare and adequately ramp up our infrastructure, our workforce, and everything else that we need in order to make it possible to make this transition happen on the scale necessary to meet our climate goals. And not only is it a really fair and reasonable way of making sure that there are clean cars on the road, We also believe it's equitable because the majority of new car buyers in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, as well as across the country, tend to be higher income. And so a phase out of new gasoline powered cars would only affect new car buyers who tend to be higher income. And therefore, we think it's a really fair way to make sure that we get an increasing amount of clean cars on the road to meet our climate goals. It's also worth noting that a majority of Americans never buy a new car in their lifetime. About 3 times as many secondhand cars are sold as new cars. And so with this in mind, we think it's important to target new car sales through a phase-out policy because it essentially controls what vehicles are going to be on the secondhand market. And so if we want the majority of Americans to be able to access clean electric vehicles, then making sure that the supply of new cars is all electric is a really fair and easy way to do that. Green energy consumers did not come up with the idea of a phase out of gas-powered car sales. This is an idea that has been gaining traction in many states and also other countries for quite a few years now. So California at the end of 2020 announced that they would be phasing out the sale of new gas-powered cars starting in 2035. And since then, New York State has adopted such a policy. And just 2 weeks ago, Washington State passed a bill that committed to a 2030 phase-out date. So not only is the idea gaining more traction, the target date by which vehicles are going to be phased out is getting to be more ambitious. We think a 2030 date is right for Massachusetts and Rhode Island because it's aspirational, it's not binding. So we know that Massachusetts and Rhode Island don't control a huge part of the car market, but a 2030 date is really reflective of where the technology is going, where automakers are putting in money to create new vehicles, and also it aligns with what other very large car markets are doing. And so considering the fact that Massachusetts and Rhode Island are responsible for a relatively small portion of new car sales nationally, we think this is really doable even though our states are small. And the whole point of the phase-out policy is not just to set an ambitious goal, but it's to create a plan so that we can meet our climate targets. And without setting a date by which we anticipate 100% of new car sales being electric, we're not going to be able to plan for infrastructure and workforce and all of those other really necessary components adequately. And just kind of hand-wavy saying, yeah, we need more charging infrastructure or more people to be installing EV charging is not really going to cut it. So we think that a 2030 phase-out date kind of can align all of these different moving parts to clarify where the market is headed in our 2 states. And as I already noted, you can see here's a map globally of what other countries are doing to phase out gasoline-powered cars. So this is larger than Massachusetts and Rhode Island or even the United States. This is a global movement and a transition. Bringing it back to the local side, our partners at Cultura, which is a nonprofit based in California that has really kickstarted the campaign to phase out gasoline-powered cars by 2030, did some polling nationally and specifically in Massachusetts to get a sense of what Americans think about this idea. And it turns out the idea of a phase-out is really popular among Americans across the board. And support was particularly high in Massachusetts, and so we think support would be high in Rhode Island as well. So it turns out the majority of people in Massachusetts, 62%, support a policy that would phase out the sale of new gas-powered cars starting in 2030. So this is a popular way to make sure clean cars are on the road. And again, people think that 2030 is a reasonable date. So I know I talked a lot about what we want to see happen in 2030 and a little bit about making sure the market is headed in that direction. But Green Energy Consumers has gotten a lot of questions about the technology and the outlook and whether it's really possible to make all all car sales electric by 2030. And there's some substantial evidence that indicates we can. Some modeling indicates that EVs are going to reach upfront cost parity sometime between 2025 and 2027. What that means is around that time range, electric cars are going to be as inexpensive to buy as a comparable gas-powered car. We think that's really important because electric cars are already saving drivers money on a lifetime basis, but lots of drivers are still struggling with the slight upfront cost premium of an electric car. So we think that once EVs decrease in cost on an upfront basis, it's going to be a no-brainer for lots of drivers who want to be owning an affordable, reliable electric car. And so that crossover point is a few years ahead of when we think a phase out could potentially start. So that's really encouraging. And really in the last year, things have shifted dramatically in terms of the commitments that automakers have made about electric vehicles. So this is just a small sampling of the different commitments that these automakers have made, major ones in the US, to increase EV sales. Specifically, it's not just, investments or commitments to go carbon neutral or net zero, but it's real money down to make sure that automakers are producing electric vehicles that consumers want. I'm going to highlight just a few. Ford is investing $22 billion through 2025 in electric vehicles. They're making their first pickup truck, the Ford F-150 Lightning, that's electric, available for sale this year. We're seeing Stellantis, which is the parent company of Jeep, Dodge, Chrysler, and Ram, is saying that they expect half of their sales are going to be electric in North America by 2030. In Europe, they're expecting 100% of sales to be electric by 2030, and all kinds of other commitments that indicate, this isn't just, a short-term trend. It's where the car market is going. And because there's significant money being spent to increase EV production, for example, it's not something that can easily be rolled back. So we expect all of these commitments to move forward, regardless of who is in the Oval Office or what else happens politically in the next 8 years. So this shift is happening. Now, I will pass it over to Larry to talk a little bit more about what we're doing in Massachusetts in order to promote this idea.
Thank you, Mel. Great job. First, I want to answer some questions that we've got through the Q&A function. One question was, why is the Transportation Climate Initiative no longer on the table? It's called TCI, Transportation Climate Initiative. That was what we were hoping was going to be a regional effort from several New England states down to the mid-Atlantic states. Massachusetts was perhaps one of the leaders in the discussion. What that would have done was actually put a cap on emissions of gasoline and diesel fuel in the participating states. And that cap, the amount of emissions would go down every year, be sort of a regional compact that would cause emission reduction and also require petroleum sellers to buy allowances. They'd have to pay for the allowances, and that money could be funded to support things like public transportation and so forth. We were advocates for that in both states, but the state of Connecticut in particular got cold feet, and the governor there withdrew his support. And shortly thereafter, the governors of Massachusetts and Rhode Island withdrew their support. And so it may come back at another date. We hope it does, but right now it does seem to be off the table. And it may take a couple of years before it comes back again. And we think it's an opportunity missed, but that puts more pressure on states that have climate goals in order to achieve the goals. One question was, the Gulf of Maine has had warming significantly higher than maybe even the rest of the world. and was wondering if that was related to the emissions of gasoline and diesel fuel in New England. And I am by no means a climate scientist, but I'm pretty sure we cannot tie that kind of correlation together with the pollution we have that would cause in one location in New England causing warming in the Gulf of Maine, because all the warming from the greenhouse gases that are emitted by the vehicles goes into the atmosphere, gets mixed up with all the other emissions from all over the world. That's heating up the atmosphere. That's heating up the oceans all over the place. So, but it is somewhat ironic, of course, that our emissions for transportation have gone up in our states, and our own backyard is warming up quite a bit as well. One question was, where can we find definitive data about the number of EVs and internal combustion vehicles? There are a few databases that we pull from when we can. They come with a bit of a lag. Mal, do you want to speak to that? There's one called Atlas that we try to look at. Is that correct?
Yeah, so Atlas is a nonprofit that works nationally to provide policy research for EV advocates, and they do a pretty good job of tracking it. To be honest, Green Energy Consumers usually looks at a couple sources. So usually when for example, there are some interesting proposals from the utilities to increase charging infrastructure in Massachusetts. And so they worked with DOER, which is a state agency, to provide some more updated numbers. But there's not one solid resource to get that kind of information, but we can follow up with the question asker and kind of show what we use.
Okay, great. So I'm going to dive in now into what's going on in Massachusetts, and I'll be brief and turn it over to Mal to talk about Rhode Island. So we are talking to legislators and other advocates around the state in Massachusetts about legislation that could be incorporated into another climate bill. Massachusetts passed a bill, a very good bill in 2021, but both the House and the Senate are working on doing another one, and we're glad to see that. The 2022 climate bill will probably have something about offshore wind, renewable energy, probably addressing buildings, and we want to make sure that transportation emissions are covered in the bill. And we all have our work to do, and we'll get to that about where you can come in as constituents later in this presentation. So if they're going to do a climate bill, we would like Massachusetts to set the goal, just like Washington State did, of phasing out the sale of new gasoline-powered cars by 2030. That should be a goal. We'll get into that in a bit. We want to institute an aggressive timeline to electrify public fleets, especially public transit and school buses. As we say, EVs are cool, electric buses are cooler, and electric school buses are the coolest. I believe that Mayor Michelle Wu of Boston earlier today announced that by 2030, 100% of the school buses in Boston will be electric, and we applaud that. There should be a plan to build out charging infrastructure to support all the cars that we need. Approximately 1 million EVs by 2030 is what we need in Massachusetts. And we need to make sure that the policies are economically efficient and fair and equitable. We think if there's good planning at the state level, we can get to the infrastructure we need better, faster, and cheaper. To reiterate, we want to make sure that the cleaning up the electric transportation system would be prioritizing overburdened and underserved communities. And we want to offer better and more equitable incentives for EV purchases, so people who need them the most can get an incentive to do that. We want to direct the electric utilities to offer time varying rates. I have an electric car. I actually have two. Right now, I pay the same rate whether I charge during peak hours of the electricity grid or off peak hours, and that doesn't make any sense. There should be a substantial incentive to get people with electric cars to charge off peak, because the charging electric car, you can easily schedule it in almost probably 95% cases, you can schedule it at night while you're sleeping or on the weekend when there's low demand on the electricity grid. And so we think that the utilities need to get with the program on that one. We want to support the electrification of private fleets. That's really where we can get to a tipping point when it could be truck fleets, vans, it could be passenger cars, it could be the Ubers and the Lyfts. There's a great economic case to be had, and so there could be education is needed to be done. Maybe it's the charging of infrastructure, but that needs to be a focus. And if we can get some of these market segments moving faster, then the cost of electric cars will come down faster for all of us. And then finally, we want to incorporate EV charging and EV readiness into a statewide building code. Next slide. So we have shown some model legislation to legislators that would have like these 4 basic components. The first one, as I said, was to define a 2030 goal for light duty vehicles. That's cars and pickup trucks. And then we want to have public fleet purchases be electric. We support a bill that would have the MBTA bus fleet be electric by 2030. For other regional transit authorities, maybe the Pioneer Valley or Merrimack Valley, and there are many others around the state, perhaps give them a little bit longer because they're not quite as large as the MBTA to become all electric. And then we want medium and heavy duty vehicles to be electric, 30% by 2030. There are huge emission reduction potentials with medium and heavy duty vehicles. The larger they are, the more likely that they'll be burning diesel, which is pretty nasty in terms of public health, particularly in areas that have low and moderate income people and people of color in the community. As I said, we want to implement no regrets policies. We want to have more effective and equitable purchase incentives, time varying rates. But one of the big parts of what we're asking is a scoping plan. We want there to be an interdepartmental approach to this because right now in Massachusetts, EVs are somewhat affected by actions of the Department of Transportation, the Department of Energy Resources, the Department of Environmental Protection, and the Department of Public Utilities. And the utilities occasionally will propose plans to the Department of Public Utilities, but we think that there needs to be one central agency that does the planning, that tries to figure out how are we going to get to where we need, which department needs to be engaged, and where are we going to put the charging infrastructure, what kind of charging infrastructure, who's going to pay for it, and who's going to benefit from it all. And right now, we are not going to get to our 1 million EVs by 2030 if under the current structure of state government. And then finally, if we're going to go for this 2030 goal, we need to have some regulations in place by 2025 that are consistent with federal law. So I'll touch on that. It's important in both states. The only state in the country that is allowed to set its own emissions and fuel economy standards is California. They have an exemption. And other states can piggyback onto California if they want to. But sort of Congress established that California exemption a few years ago because it's so large. They don't want to have 50 states setting standards. So what we want is for Massachusetts and Rhode Island to piggyback onto California. This year, it looks like California is going to establish the requirement that all new cars sold in California be electric as of 2035. And so if that's the case, we can't jump ahead of California by federal law. But what we want here is to establish 2030 as the goal. We want both states to be ready for 100% EVs by 2030. And we believe that before 2030, California will probably try to speed up its adoption rate because of all the things that Mal said about the need and the ability of car makers to produce electric cars by 2030. Next slide. So there are several bills in the Massachusetts legislature that we are excited about, and what we're encouraging legislators to do is to pass them all. And we're providing some wording changes. And so the first one is Senator Hines has a bill that would phase out gasoline-powered cars as of 2030. Great idea, but our analysis is that it can't happen because of the California rule that I just mentioned. The public fleet purchases bill we like very much. Then there's a public transit electrification bill. I should back up. The difference is the public fleet purchases bill, it has to do with the state and local fleet that state and local government has. Then there's the public transportation bill. And then there's, it's important to know that Massachusetts has already adopted a multi-state agreement to have 30% of medium and heavy duty vehicles by 2030. Next slide. There are several bills that would create a more effective and equitable EV incentive program. There is a program that we've had that's going on right now. If you buy or lease an electric car that costs less than $50,000, you can get a rebate from the state. It's called More EV of $2,500. It's a good program. We want it continued. We think it's important that legislators find the money to continue it. But several legislators have filed bills that would change it up a bit. Some would have make it available to used electric cars, which is a good idea. Some would make it available, perhaps enhanced, if somebody has been driving a high emission vehicle, perhaps a big SUV or a pickup truck, and they put a lot of miles on it every year, they could essentially retire that vehicle and get an EV rebate instead. And there's some data showing that a relatively small number of vehicles in a state, maybe 10% of the vehicles might cause 30 or 40% of the gasoline consumption and emissions. So we want to maybe attack those. There's a couple of bills of that area in that field area. Then there's another bill that would exempt EVs from the sales tax. That approach is a good one. Some people need that benefit as fast as they can to defray the upfront purchase. The only issue, the problem with the state rebate is when you buy a car, you file paperwork and you get the check for $2,500 from the state rebate about 6 weeks later. We already talked about time varying rates. There are some bills that that would do that. We think we have language that's a little bit more specific and therefore better. There is a bill regarding a scoping plan that we like, but that one was put into a study and we want to reinvigorate that particular bill. So there are components all over the place that we're just trying to corral them together, ask legislators to realize that if you did any one of these bills, we're not going to get to our goal of 1 million EVs by 2030. You have to do them all, and that's important. And we have to have a plan. So next slide. And that would be back to you, Mel.
Thanks, Larry. It's always great to see how many different bills are in play in Massachusetts. I think Rhode Island is kind of gradually scaling up to that. But in Rhode Island, we do have kind of one bill that ties a lot of these components together that we've been talking about. It's called the Electric Transportation Act. It was introduced a few weeks ago by Senator DeMario and Representative Courtbrand. And there's essentially 4 key components of the bill that we're excited about. So the first is it ties Rhode Island to any advanced car regulations or any advanced fuel economy regulations across the board that come out of California. As Larry noted earlier, California is allowed to set its own advanced standards, and other states can sign on to that on a voluntary basis. But Massachusetts has had the benefit of a statute in its general law that commits the state to adopting those advanced fuel standards out of California. And so that makes sure that they get the benefits of whatever California does much, much sooner. Because whenever there's a delay in the timeline for when these regulations are adopted, it results in a delay of the benefits that we receive as a state signing on to those rules coming out of California. So committing Rhode Island to adopting those regulations on a timely basis is something that we think will help not just for cars, but for electrifying medium and heavy duty vehicles as well, and also fleet vehicles. So all of those exciting regulations are coming out of California. The second key component is it establishes the scoping plan that Larry was talking about to make sure that Rhode Island does everything that it needs to do to ramp up sales of electric vehicles from now until 2030. The third component is it establishes an equity advisory board to help assess what priorities are for policy and legislation to make sure that everyone, including low and moderate income people and people who don't drive at all, see the benefits of electric transportation in a way that's fair and equitable. So we're excited about that piece and hope that we can bring experts in from the community to help continue to guide what a fair, clean transportation system will look like. Excuse me. And then the final piece is a commitment for Rhode Island to lead by example. The fourth piece requires the state to make all of its vehicle procurements electric by 2027. So that's 3 years ahead of what the 2030 goal would be for all other cars. And the reasoning for that advanced date is, first, it aligns with the Biden administration's goal for the federal fleet. So we think we should be moving at least as fast as what the federal fleet can do. And then the second piece is that a lot of the planning for charging infrastructure and EV procurements on the state level is already happening, but it's not happening with very much urgency. And it's also, there's not a clear timeline on how quickly the EV procurements need to happen. And so we think that that piece will be very helpful. And I want to save plenty of time for questions, so I'll just quickly walk through key elements of the scoping plan for the legislation in Rhode Island. So one of the key things that the legislation will do is help calculate how many charging stations we need and establish goals to develop the workforce that we need in order to install those. Another really important element is that we know we can't only be electrifying cars to meet our climate goals. So the bill includes some language about how we also need to be reducing vehicle miles traveled by investing in the Transit Master Plan and Bicycle Mobility Plan in Rhode Island, which are two very good sets of documents that just don't have the funding yet. And so the bill has language related to supporting those elements for planning. Another really important piece is making sure that the utility and the Public Utilities Commission are all on the same page in terms of upgrading our infrastructure and making sure that there are specific EV charging plans to help keep charging affordable, and also make sure that the minimum amount of upgrades are done to make the transition to electric cars cost effective for ratepayers, while also making sure we're scaling that up appropriately to meet the increased demand. And then finally, this last piece is a little bit more about what I was talking about earlier for the state leading by example. So we need to be able to plan where charging stations are going to be needed for the state to electrify its own fleet. We also think that that'll help build up the expertise so that the state can also help municipalities do their own planning, because we know that that's a barrier for cities and towns that don't have as many resources but want to access the cost savings of an electric vehicle. Back to you, Larry.
Thank you, Mel. Well, so now we're going to just try to spend some time answering some questions, but what I want to highlight is that we need your support in both states. We have great representation from both states, and actually from some states outside Massachusetts and Rhode Island, so we welcome those out-of-towners. So we will send you an email with information about how you can contact us. But what we'll need from you is to, we'll send you some ideas on how you can send a letter or an email to your legislator in either state. And if you're part of an organization at the local level, state level, or what have you, we would appreciate it if your organization would be willing to sign on in support. So we'll be in touch on that within a couple of days after this webinar, because we need your help. Legislators are hearing that they need to address climate emissions, and they're hearing that they need to address transportation emissions, but we got to keep working to make sure that they do the right thing. As I said, there's a lot of different bills, and the bill in Rhode Island is very comprehensive. A lot of legislators will think of how to reduce emissions. They'll think of one or two ideas, and that's great, but we need them to think of a comprehensive approach. And because, you know, in order to get this done, we need to make over 1 million decisions. People in companies need to decide to switch out a gasoline-powered car for an electric car, and that means that they have to learn about where they're going to get the car. They're going to have to learn about how they're going to charge it, and so we need to enable that kind of decision making. This is all a little bit big of a challenge. Over the last several years, Massachusetts and Rhode Island have dramatically reduced emissions from the electricity sector. But that's a little bit easier because we're dealing with fewer participants, the utilities and the power plant generators. Now we're really talking about all of us, and that's where you all come in. Next slide. No, I think we're at the end. And so I just want to make sure we cover the questions. Can you see a couple questions perhaps you could take?
Yes, I do. I see a really important question from Robert, who noted that Ford is only producing 15,000 F-150s in 2022 and 50,000 in 2023. And that the Nissan Ariya, which is a highly anticipated electric car coming out by Nissan, is having trouble fulfilling all of the reservations that people have made for that car. So the question is essentially, are these bait and switches? What are the automakers doing? And so this is an important question for a few reasons. The first is that obviously right now is a unique time in the car market because of supply chain issues. And so not just for electric cars, but all cars are extremely limited in supply, and it's hard for you to go out to a dealership and buy the car that you want, especially if you're going for a more affordable, lower trim model compared to some of the more expensive high-end models that automakers are prioritizing. So it is just a really unique time for automakers that are struggling to keep up with demand. But kind of on the flip side, it's clear that the demand is there, right? Like people want these vehicles, and it's hard for automakers to shift from a gas-powered business model to one that's, you know, making the transition to providing more electric models. And so we think a policy like this will actually help provide clarity as to where the direction of the market is going and encourage automakers to ramp up their investments as quickly as possible. Obviously, all of that's limited by what's going on in the market. And, you know, I think we'll see that issue resolve in the next couple of years. But the more of a demand that there is and the more policy, like the phase out there is to kind of change what the automakers are doing, that's also going to make the 2030 phase out date more feasible to achieve. So you can think of it as like a self-fulfilling cycle. So I don't think it's a bait and switch, but it is reasonable to be concerned about what the market's looking like now and where it might be going. You have anything to add to that, Larry?
No, that's a good answer. I agree with that. There are a couple of other questions about how do we educate people about electric vehicles? And that's another component of why we think both states need to have a plan for that, because polls have shown, numerous surveys have shown that people are grasping the idea that EVs are better. And they expect over the next few years to get an electric vehicle, but they're holding back because of concerns about charging infrastructure, or maybe the type of EV that they want is not available and they think it will be available in a few years. And a lot of people have misconceptions. Even though support for EVs is pretty high, a lot of people don't realize that it's cheaper to run an electric car on electricity than a gasoline-powered car on gasoline. and that it's cheaper to maintain an electric car than a gasoline powered car. So a lot of education has to be done. That is something we do at our organization. If you go to our website, greenenergyconsumers.org/drivegreen, Mal and other staff in our organization do a great job of trying to explain to people how an EV can fit in with their life. And that's going to be a big part of, we're going to continue to do that. And we hope that the states will do that as well. Another question was, they noted that perhaps we need more than 1 million EVs by 2030 in Massachusetts. And we tend to agree, but right now, we're just trying to go with what's stated in the climate action plan that is out there. And you know, we see that every day we're finding out that the news about climate's getting worse. But at a minimum, what we're trying to, that's why we think it's so important to start phasing out gasoline by 2030. And then another question that comes up occasionally is gasoline taxes paid for road construction. Where will the funds needed to be to maintain and construct the roads when using electricity to charge an EV? That is what we think it will be an important question, but right now it's not. The number of electric cars on the road is less than 5% of the total in both states, Massachusetts and Rhode Island. You saw the numbers, only 4,000 electric cars in Rhode Island, 40,000 in Massachusetts. There are 5.5 million cars in Massachusetts. In 2030, if we have 1 million cars, that's only 20%, less than 20% of the cars in Massachusetts will be electric at that point. And you know, here's a fun fact. I don't know if people realize that the gas tax in both states covers substantially less than half of the cost of maintaining the roads. We end up subsidizing the roads through other taxes besides the gasoline tax. So we're saying in the next few years, we need to get EV adoption up dramatically. And then when we see that people are beginning to buy a lot of electric cars, there's no doubt about it that someone who drives an electric car should chip in and pay for the cost of maintaining the roads. But here's another point. In both states, electric cars still right now cost a little bit more than a gasoline powered car. And so for that reason, they're paying more in sales tax in both states. So when you put it all together, I don't think it's true that a electric car today is contributing less to road repair than a gasoline powered car.
I would just add to, at least in Rhode Island, about 1/3 of the current state gas tax is used to fund the RIPTA bus system. And so obviously we want to make sure that the bus system continues to get support and actually has increasing support to help people rely less on cars across the board, especially for people who struggle to afford the cost of car ownership in general. A better transit system could provide a cheaper, better option for lots of households. And so, you know, while that's important to find a new revenue source, that's almost kind of like a parallel conversation because the current gas tax isn't supporting all of our transportation needs anyway.
Paul asked, for people like him who live in cities, we need more public charging in neighborhoods and that there's range anxiety. Well, we agree. And that's why the state needs to plan out the charging infrastructure. We don't just want to sort of drop the charging stations willy-nilly into our states. We want to put them where they're going to benefit people. And so it's common sense. If you're going to have an electric car, you have to have a plan for charging it. I'm fortunate that I can plug it into my single family home without an issue, but so we need to have more charging in public neighborhoods. On the issue of range anxiety, I would say that what we've found is that people who have electric cars, after they've had an electric car for a year, they have realized that the range anxiety that they had before getting the car has lessened, and that it's a smaller issue than people thought it might have been before they bought the car. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is that the battery sizes are getting larger. My car has a range of 259 miles on a full charge, but I hardly ever drive it that far. And the amount of charging stations that are out in the world are growing. And so we're finding range anxiety to be less of an issue than it used to be. Any other questions?
There was a question from Mary about what does it take to persuade legislators to do the right thing and vote for environmental bills? And I would just say a simple act of reaching out and speaking to your elected officials and saying, this is something that's important to me, prioritize this, is really impactful. Even if you are represented by someone who agrees with you and votes for environmental legislation all the time, it's really important for them to continue to get messages from their constituents that say, continue to work on this issue, so that, you know, they kind of keep going in the right direction. So I would say, look out for our follow-up email to this webinar, and we can provide you some more input and direction on what you might say to your elected official, specifically on the issue of supporting a phase out of gasoline.
Great. Folks, I want to thank you. The hour's gone by kind of quickly. I wish we had more time for questions, but we know everyone's got a busy day. But please email us if you have questions. If there are questions about Massachusetts, you could email me, Larry at greenenergyconsumers.org. And if you have questions about Rhode Island, Mal at greenenergyconsumers.org. We'd be happy to hear from you. And we will be getting more information out to you because we need your help. So with that, I'll say have a great day.